guys, Stefan Fischer here from AllOffroad. Thanks a lot for joining me today. In today's video I would like to give you an update of my Landcruiser 105 Super Tourer build and what I have changed since my last video. The link to that video is somewhere up here, and this is pretty much version 2 of my build, and I will update you about all the changes I have made, and I will also tell you a little bit what worked, what didn't work, because there are a few things I tried out and that didn't work too well. So I give you a good idea about that as well. Before we start, please keep in mind my channel is completely self-funded, so it would be greatly appreciated if you could like, subscribe, and if you can, maybe head over to Patreon. You get a little bit earlier access to all of my videos. You would really help me out with a bit of microfunding, and maybe shout me a cup or two of coffee a month. One of the little issues I had with the Cruiser since the engine conversion is that my air condition worked perfectly well in 95% of situation and cases. However, in very hot conditions, say for example in the desert, and if there wasn't much airflow, my air condition pretty much would cut out. And you can imagine in the desert, especially crawling along, not much airflow, super hot, no air conditioning, wasn't very pleasant. So I mucked quite a bit around trying to improve that. It's still not perfect, so what changes we made I'm gonna show you now. It is a bit hard to see, but one issue was that the intercooler pretty much was right in front of the radiator. And you see the air conditioning condenser is in the middle here, and that was all so tightly wedged together that without much driving wind, the condenser pretty much would get too hot. So what we did, we moved the intercooler a bit further forward. That allows a bit more room, and then a bit hard to see, but in there are two spell fans which drive further air through the air conditioning condenser and the radiator. And that really has helped quite a bit to improve that. I also, because I have the A750 automatic transmission, we put in an extra derail transmission cooler. It's a stacked cooler with a lot of cooling capacity, and that really makes quite a difference with the transmission temperatures. Actually, to an extent where I now have blocked that slightly off here, because it becomes very cool. Obviously a transmission also should not run too cool, and I never be over 100 or 90 degrees, even in the desert and sand driving and so on, so that works very well. For that transmission cooler I also have a spell fan underneath there, which again a bit hard to see, but you see it probably there. And that fan I can control from the inside of my vehicle. I have a button here. I also put in a high stall torque converter, which changes the stall from 1800 RPM to around 2500 RPM. To be honest, initially I didn't really appreciate that mod because I didn't notice much difference. However, once I've been in the desert for the first time with that new mod, I really started to like it. With the old torque converter, once you put the foot down, the torque comes on gradually. As the turbo spools up, the torque increases, but that is not very helpful in deep sand. With the new high stall torque converter, Once the power is there, you also have the torque, so it makes a huge difference in sand. Because I do a lot of desert driving and really need good reach in regards to fuel, I also replaced my main fuel tank, which was still a standard tank. I think that was 80 liters or so, with a 140 liter long range fuel tank. So all up I have now 266 liters of fuel. My Diff still had the standard gearing, and with the 35s I changed now the gearing to 4.88, and that really makes a huge difference, especially in sand and at startup. That's definitely a worthwhile modification if you run 35-inch tires on your vehicle. Yeah, Drifter provided me with some factory 55 gear, which is this aluminium Fairlead, and also the flat link. Especially the flat link I really like, because that's all very smooth, and because I moved mainly to soft shackles when the situation allows it. With the factory 55 flat link I can easily fit a soft shackle in there. It is nice round aluminium, and it also saves a little bit of weight. I recently also needed to change my coils because the Slinky coils, which I had with the Icon suspension, unfortunately broke after a year, and it seemed to be very difficult to get any warranty out of that. AllOffroad created a set of King custom coils for 105. They actually took my Slinky coils out and measured them and so on, because the coils itself were pretty good in regards to ride quality. But yeah, they broke a bit too early for my liking. I've actually never had a coil break. Obviously everything can break, just never has happened to me beforehand, and after a year I wasn't too impressed with that. So now I have King custom coils in. I haven't tested them too extensively, but I've just came back from Fraser, and Fraser I reckon is actually a brilliant test for coils and suspension setup, especially if you do the inland tracks, because there's a lot of undulating area, a lot of suspension flex, a lot of whoopsie-doos where you can easily bump out if your suspension is not set up correctly. So far I'm super happy with that coils, and I know that I have proper warranty and that I can easily get support if I need to. Before, my Speedo was over 10 kilometers out, so I now also installed a Maxx Adaptors Speedo correction box, and now the Speedo pretty much shows me driving 3 kilometers faster than I actually drive, and that is, you know, how it should be from factory. I also changed my light bars to the Ultravision Nitro Max bars. I have a 305 on the roof and a 205 down here. The 205 is a cold light. That's one of the great things in the Ultravision bars. You can get them in warm light or in cold light. So this is the cold light one. On top of the roof I have the warm light on. I've now driven nearly 50,000 kilometers with that light bars. On the Canning I did run them during daytime as well, because with the strong corrugation I wanted to see how well they last, and so far no issue whatsoever. They work perfectly. The light output is amazing, and it's an Australian company, 5 years warranty, so I really can't fault them. On my touring vehicles I always had a fixed mounted solar panel on the roof. I tried several different panels, from semi-flexible to recently the fixed with the ridged aluminium edges. However, they were all from eBay, and to be honest none lasted longer than 1.5 years. So my last panel pretty much went on the Canning, and yeah, no wonder with all the corrugation. So I contacted Redac, and they were happy to provide me one of their 80-watt panels, but that is one of the glass panels, so it is a little bit heavier. It has a frame around, but I really hope that that will last longer. And it turns out now I only have an 80-watt panel. Before I supposedly had a 120-watt panel, and the 80 watt provides me nearly more output than the 120 watt. However, that is probably together with the new MPPT solar charger I also bought, which is a Victron solar charger. I never received any products to test from Victron, but I have to say, together with Redac, that is my favorite company in anything in regards to electronics. I really like their products and especially love that nearly all of their products are Bluetooth enabled and have a corresponding app. When I changed to the Icon suspension setup, I also changed my Super Pro radius arms for some butt custom arms. I really like the Super Pro arms and had absolutely no issue with it, except that they are only suitable really up to 2.5 inch. And with my lift, which is nearly 4 inch, I only had 1.5 degree caster. And I really wanted to have around 3 degrees caster. Unfortunately, Super Pro makes these arms only for 2.5 inch lift, so I decided to go with some Butts custom arms which are suitable for a 4 inch lift and provide me now with a 3 degree caster. You may also notice that I changed my headlights back to my standard headlights. I had some aftermarket headlights from eBay. I don't know that they had a particular name. They were clear, and to be honest, I really liked the look from them, but the light output was not very good. And the way how they were designed at the end, you couldn't really upgrade them, say for example to LED. So I decided to get back to my standard lights, but then put a LED upgrade. So I now have Philips Altinon LED upgraded headlights in, and yeah, the light output is much better, even though I preferred the look of the other lights. But yeah, I don't want to have form over function. Function most important for me. Let's talk about my battery setups. I had quite a few battery setups over the time. I started with a starter battery and AGM battery, both under the bonnet. Then I went to a crystal lead battery for a short while. That didn't go too well. Roughly 2 years ago, I switched to a Revolution LiFePo4 battery in the rear and only had my starter battery under the bonnet. And that really was a great change because it gave me finally the power requirements I needed. It gave me pretty fast charging times with the Redac BCDC 1240 and later 1250. So that was a setup I definitely was very happy with. However, when I started to look for a different LiFePo4 setup for the Jeep, which I just bought, I got onto DCS. Actually, one of my YouTube subscribers alerted me to them, and they offered a dual underbonnet LiFePo4 setup. And that intrigued me. At that stage, my knowledge was that, you know, lithium is probably not suitable for underbonnet. That's what most manufacturers said. So I started looking into that system and I contacted DCS. I had many chats with them. And while that battery setup wasn't suitable for the Jeep, what I was really looking for, because it just didn't have enough room under the bonnet, I thought it would be actually a great idea to test that maybe on the Landcruiser. And Paul from DCS also was quite interested having someone to test the battery system under the most extreme conditions. So after 3 months of more research into an underbonnet setup, I finally bit the bullet and said, yep, let's do that. So DCS kindly provided me 2 100 amp hours batteries for a dual underbonnet setup for the Cruiser. The normal dual underbonnet setup is 2 times 75 amp hours, simply because of the fact that I have a high output alternator which delivers over 200 amps straight out of it. So I needed bigger batteries to cope with that high input charge. While it still is early days, I only have the setup in for 10 months now. However, I have one reasonably long family trip with it, and I have done one trip to Fraser. So I have a good initial idea. And so far, I really love the system. So let me go through the benefits and why I decided with the DCS system and why that is probably different from the most other LiFePo4 systems on the market currently. DCS is an Australian company who designs and develops all their battery systems in-house. So they don't just purchase stuff from China or get parts from China and whack it together. They do all the development and all the research. They have big contracts with Telstra. They do military specs battery systems. So they really know what they're doing and are a specialist in that area. If you compare the battery specs of the DCS batteries against any other LiFePo4 battery on the market here in Australia, you will see that DCS probably is the best battery on the market. Their case design with thermal efficiency in mind is all developed here in Australia. They have a military-grade battery management system which only shuts down at 110 degrees. The most battery management systems from other manufacturers don't last much higher than 50 degrees. The battery has a built-in Bluetooth sender and a Bluetooth app which tells you about all vital stats of that battery. The battery has a low temperature discharge protection. It has a very high cycle life. If you discharge it to 80% of depth of discharge, you get 2,500 cycles. If you discharge it to 50%, you get 5,000 cycles. Like with any battery, if you put it under the bonnet, the lifespan of the battery will be reduced. I'm not sure yet how much life I will get out of that dual setup. However, DCS warrants it for 3 years, but we hope that we get between 5 and 7 years out of that battery under the bonnet. If you have the battery not under the bonnet, somewhere in the back of the car, theoretically you should get 10 years and more out of a LiFePo4 battery. The DCS BMS system is so well designed that in the most cases you actually don't need a DC to DC charger. So my dual setup is charged straight from the alternator. That means, I don't need a DC-DC charger, and I can put the full output charge of my alternator into that batteries for super fast charging. Let's talk about weight saving and the power available. For example, one DCS battery weighs just shy of 13 kilogram. The equivalent AGM battery weighs 30 kilogram. My two 100 amp hour LiFePo4 batteries give me 200 amp hours of usable power. If I would like to have the same available power with AGM batteries, I really need 4 100 amp hour AGM batteries. That means 120 kilogram of weight, not to mention that I wouldn't have the space anywhere in the cruiser to put them, versus 25 kilogram of weight with two 100 amp hour LiFePo4 batteries. So that alone makes it worthwhile for me. So while I can't give you yet a long-term review of it, so far I'm super happy with it, and it is the best battery system to date. So the available power I have, the super quick recharge time, the weight and space savings, very hard to beat. And if you actually compare it price-wise, it is cheaper as an AGM if you want to have the same power output and lifespan. Let me quickly explain how the current battery setup is wired. I've got the two 100 amp hour batteries under the bonnet, and they are connected in a permanent parallel configuration. I initially had a Victron Battery Protect BP220 in front of or behind the grille in the front of the vehicle, but that overheated, so I moved that in the back of the vehicle. That would then disconnect both batteries from the main load, everything but starting pretty much at 12.8 volt. and that means I always will have around 20% in the batteries to start the vehicle. That setup wasn't too difficult because the Revolution lithium-ion auxiliary battery, which I had before in the back, was pretty much also in the same position where now the Victron battery protect is. In the same position is also my Victron Smart Solar 120 MPPT solar charger. So a few people asked me why I changed my battery setup from the Revolution to a dual DCS under bonnet setup. 3 main reasons. Reason number 1 is that a normal starter battery weighs around 30 kg and is a one-trick pony. It only starts the vehicle a few times a day, and that's pretty much all it does. And I have 30 kg sitting there without much use for me. With a dual LiFePo4 setup now, I have 200 usable amp hours under the bonnet instead of having the 100 amp hour starter battery sitting there idle. So I pretty much increased my available power by around 80% because 20% is reserved for starting. Number 2 is weight saving. When I exchanged my starter battery for the DCS LiFePo4 battery, I saved another 16-17 kg. The third reason is redundancy. Now with 2 dual LiFePo4s under the bonnet, I pretty much have redundancy for starting. I have redundancy for all my auxiliary loads, because if ever one of my batteries would fail, I still can use the other battery for starting as well as keep my fridge and all my other stuff running. So that are the 3 main reasons for me to change to a dual under bonnet setup. I will do a detailed video of the DCS dual lithium setup after I tested that a little bit more. I recently replaced my cheap Moreni awning, which is my overnight quick awning when I don't expect rain or so on. It's a 2.5 meter by 2.5 meter. I replaced that with a SupaPeg Easy Awn. I'm eyeing that SupaPeg awnings for quite some time now because they have quite a few great design features. And that awning now I have on for 6 months. So far I'm super happy with it. Even though we had a big wheelie on the last Simpson Desert Trip, which blew the awning over. However, that same wheelie lifted up 80 kilograms of solar panels and just tossed them around like nothing. So I don't think anything would have secured that. But the beauty was I just ordered 2 new plastic hinges, replaced the hinges, and the awning is what I'm still using. So most of the parts there you can actually replace. It's all Australian made, it's Australian canvas. And yeah, I really like it. But I will do a full review of that awning after a year of use. The guys from SupaPeg recently also provided me one of their rapid wing awnings, which has now replaced my Fox wing. But with all the corona stuff going on here and the trips cancelled, I didn't have a chance to test that yet. So I keep that for a later date. On the Easy awning, I still use the Smart Touring System's quick release brackets, and I have them on the vehicle now for over a year, including the canning stock route and a lot of corrugation. And yeah, that works brilliantly and is a great way to remove your awning within pretty much a minute. In regards to my UHF radios, I made a few changes there. I used to have 2 ICOM. I still have 1 ICOM in the vehicle, but my main ICOM, my microphone just disintegrated in my hand on last year's Fraser trip, just fell apart. However, that microphone wasn't covered under warranty anymore, which look is fair enough. But I had my eye on the new GME XRS system for a little while because I really like the idea that you can upgrade firmware, that you can introduce new features via the firmware updates, and I also like this gorgeous OLED display. So I contacted GME, or maybe even they contacted me then, so that did fit quite well. and they offered me one of their XRS 370 system to test. And I have that system now in my vehicle for a year. I made a separate review about that system, which I'll probably link somewhere here up to. But yeah, that just works. Brilliant system. I did install a second loudspeaker, which I had for all my systems though. So actually I used the one I had on the ICOM now. And yeah, I really like the system. I got used to having all the controls in the handset. I still like to have a unit where you have the controls all in the unit, to be honest. But the handset now, yeah, it works nice, and it obviously has a few advantages. It makes the unit much smaller. You can tuck it away somewhere. Yeah, the UHF just works. Very simple. I know GME has excellent warranty. I tested that previously, and is an Australian company, so that are all big factors for me. And yeah, can't fault it. As a matter of fact, I have the same radio now in the Jeep. One other change I recently made is exchanging my M2K high output alternator, which I received from the US probably 1.5 years ago. The only issue I had in having the alternator for over a year, that my alternator bracket broke, and that was probably on the canning trip, because you really have to make sure that that lower bolt is really firmly attached. However, I changed to a rapid powered alternator after I installed my dual LiFePo4 DCS battery setup under the bonnet, simply for the fact that the rapid power alternator, I mean, first of all, it's a sealed alternator, so mud and so on can't get in. It's water cooled, so that is pretty cool to have. But more important for me, and why I made mainly the change, is that I can limit the voltage of that alternator to 13.85 volt. And for my dual underbonnet DCS lithium setup, it's just a better voltage to keep that batteries last longer under the bonnet. So that was the main reason. However, when we replaced the alternator now, I discovered that on the housing of the M2K alternator also one of the crush sleeves was cracked, and that in return broke the bracket again. So I contacted M2K, even though I don't have the alternator now anymore because I have the rapid power alternator in. I described them the problem. M2K US, what did they do? Within a week, I had a new housing, a new cover. That new housing is much deeper and reduces the size of the crush sleeve and should provide far more stability versus the old housing, and therefore during corrugation and vibration should work much better. I received that from the US in less than 7 days now. So I can really only highly recommend M2K and their customer service. What I noticed with a rapid power alternator, it's only a 200 amp hour alternator, so that's also all right with me, because with the two lithiums now I didn't want to put 270 amp constantly in there. So that is good. However, I noticed the rapid power has a far lower idling amperage. I only put around 23 amp hours in, which means 11 to 12 amp hours per battery. Versus the M2K, that was nearly over 100 amp hours, which was pretty nice. That meant with the lithium batteries, I pretty much could leave the car idle for 20 minutes and have a decent charge back in the battery. But I can't really give you more feedback so far yet. I will update you in another year's time and will tell you how that alternator goes. The M2K alternator, I would recommend it 100%. Quality unit, no issues, great customer support. So yeah, if they had a version actually which could be limited to 13.85 volt, I probably would have gone with that as well, instead of the rapid power, because the mud and completely sealed, while it's nice to have, don't get me wrong, I did in Tassie obviously some of the wet tracks like Balfour track, and it's definitely handy to have a completely sealed unit. So that is one other change I made recently. A quick update on the BFG KM3s. We are here at McConkey Hill, which is on the Canning stock route. So we have now 4/5 of Canning stock route done, as well as the Tenemai before, as well as Fraser. So I have used the tires a fair bit now, and so far they held up pretty well. The Canning has some of the roughest terrain you can imagine. Not so much if you stay on the main Canning, even though there you have very rocky terrain, you have sand, you have very sharp stones, and you certainly have scrubs and so on encroaching the track. But we decided to do a couple of side tracks, which is the old Canning, and that area was partially burned. Many times we didn't even have a track anymore, so we had to find the track. And we drove through a lot of burnt country. Burnt country means you have hardwood stakes which are dried by the fire everywhere. So we are both actually very surprised that we made it through there for kilometers on end without any puncture. The BFG's KM3 have worn very well. Can't really complain. No big chips out of it. They look pretty good. They obviously have a few nicks. I have 2 nicks in the sidewall somewhere. Can't find it now. Here is one. And one on the other side, caused by sharp rock, but they haven't really penetrated any further. Yeah, overall, I mean, I loved the BFG KM2, and I had, I don't know, 5 or 6 set, which I purchased over the time on all of my vehicles. Yeah, I really can't fault the tire. On sand, they are, in my opinion, a bit better than the Nitro because they're a little bit softer. They don't dig that much. On the wet road, very good. I mean, consider it's a mud terrain tire, but never felt unsafe, uneasy there. On one cross-country desert trip late last year, we had overall 14 punctures, and I happened to have 3 punctures in the same tire. All 3 punctures were through the sidewall of the tire. I used a tire plug for each of the punctures and had no issue plugging the tire and actually managed to drive it home before I replaced it. Fast forward nearly another year, I'm still on the BFG KM3s. So my opinion there has not changed at all, and I would happily put another set of BFG KM3s on my Landcruiser, and I have the KM3s also on my plate truck in 37s on the Jeep, and there will be a separate review coming for that. I still have that Selfie Go 3G and 4G booster. But on the Canning trip, the antenna which came with it pretty much disintegrated and I lost it. So I just saw my antenna disappearing. The antenna for my 3G booster. GME was kind enough to provide me one of their 4705B multi-band antennas, which has now replaced that stock antenna which came with the Selfie Go booster. And yeah, that works very well. And I think I have actually slightly better reception with that antenna than with the old one. And it certainly won't wiggle loose. It is like all the GME antennas. It has spring base and it can be easily taken off. One of the big features I also like with the GME stuff, one little hex screw, and you can just unscrew the antenna and store it or exchange them. So pretty good. Engine tuning. Yeah, I try to keep that short because that is probably the darkest chapter of my whole 105 build. That did not work out very well for me. Cost me a lot of money, cost me a lot of headache, and so let me summarize that fairly briefly. I have the A750 speed auto in the cruiser, and before I started mucking around with anything on the engine, I drove the vehicle for 1 year to make sure there are no issues with the gearbox. and there were no issues. The gearbox was in top shape. I had no problem whatsoever. I then decided on recommendation of someone that a Safari Armax would be a good chip to give me a bit more power and work well. So that Safari Armax chip was put in, and within 2 weeks my gearbox pretty much lost fourth and fifth gear. Because the whole issue happened on my first drive pretty much to Wyong to Get It Automotive, who was to do a pre-trip inspection. It was just a few days before one of my trips, and it failed pretty much going up one of the hills there. At that time I didn't really know what happened. I had no clue. I never had an issue with that gearbox. All of a sudden I only had third gear. So I drove to Wyong, we had a quick look at it, then right around the corner is Wyong Automotive Transmissions. They had a look at it and said, yeah, gearbox need to be rebuilt. At this stage, I just thought it is bad luck. The gearbox had nearly 200,000 kilometers down, and even though it hadn't given me any grief, yeah, you know, stuff can happen. So I had the gearbox rebuilt, drove it back home, and on the way back home, within 20 minutes, I had the same thing happen again. Lost fourth and fifth gear. This time, obviously, I was a bit smarter. I had that happen before, you know, so I knew what to do. I right away stopped. I called Rodney from Wyong, and the only thing we both came up with is disabling that Armax. I disabled the Armax, and the problem has not reoccurred. Very simple. I then contacted Armax in Victoria. I even went out there for a day. They diagnosed everything. I was told a lot of things I didn't like, and the way how it was approached, in my opinion, was not very well handled. The end of the story was that they wouldn't put the Armax back in because they thought my gearbox had issues. And I've given all kind of funny reasons. Okay, what caused it all? No one will be able to tell you with a definite answer. The only thing I can tell you, the Armax is removed, and my same gearbox, which is supposed to have issues, has done 60,000 kilometers now without any issues. But that's not the end of the idea. That's where I should have stopped it, really. I should have removed that Armax. End of story. However, then I listened a bit more around, heard from more people, and I was told, yeah, the A750 is a bit finicky to tune. It needs to definitely be custom tuned, so you can't just put a Wagger chip in like what happened with the Armax. It needs to be custom tuned. And then I heard Just Autos in Queensland are the best there. I at the same time spoke to G-Turbo because my turbo had done 200,000. So I thought, oh, I may as well maybe go to a G-Turbo, put a Greenville Grunter in. To cut a long story short, everything was ordered. I organized the drive down to Just Autos. I organized with G-Turbo that they would send the DET chip, which they recommended, up there. That was all confirmed via email. So I drive up there, and that was timed that I had 3 days before a Fraser trip. And I had the turbo with me. The chip was to be supposed to be sent up by G-Turbo there, and I arrived there, no chip there. So I called G-Turbo, and mind you, I confirmed that 3 weeks ago. They had, I think, 6 weeks to send that thing up there. And then I was told, yeah, I didn't request for express shipping. First of all, I was never asked about express shipping. I should have never needed express shipping because there was plenty of time. Cut a long story short, the chip wasn't there. So G-Turbo then recommended that we go with a unit chip because they had a unit chip there. They put the turbo in, they put the unit chip in, and I drove away with it. Yeah, initially I hadn't too many issues. I certainly felt the power increase and so on, so that was all good. However, after a few weeks, I also lost my gear again. I lost my fifth gear. And by that time, really, I was over it. So I decided to put everything back to stock, because that was not too far before canning trip, and reliability really is just more important to me. So we started then removing the uni chip, found that whoever installed it must have started on the wrong plugs on the ECU, because we had uninsulated cables lying behind the dash. So that was all fixed and reversed. I couldn't run the G-turbo without a chip, so I had to remove the G-turbo as well. And that's when we found that actually the G-turbo was destroyed internally, because someone must have left a piece of cloth in the air intake, which at some stage went through the turbo. So it took me a bit of effort with Just Autos, but they made it good. They refunded the money for the chip and the turbo, but it was again a very costly experience. I drove down there. I then spent a week there to have the vehicle there, because initially the chip wasn't there. So it was all a big disaster. When I drove the car to Wyong automatic transmission, after Just Autos tuned it and Rodney drove it, he also said it bump slides the gears in, and that it would not be good for the longevity of the gearbox. So he recommended either again to get it retuned, and Just Autos said they would retune it, but that's for me a 2,000 kilometer drive. And again, then my need for reliability overruled my want for a little bit more power. So my verdict: if you want a reliable tourer and you have the A750, do not fiddle with it. Just leave it as it is. Obviously 3-inch exhaust, intercooler and all that stuff, yeah, 100%, but I wouldn't tune that engine with that gearbox. A lot of you asked what happened to the Icon suspension I installed 1.5 years ago and what my feedback is. For full disclosure, I like to say that I received a discount on the product to share my experience with it. Some of you may have noticed that I took the video down, which I created after my first drive, and left quite a good impression on the suspension setup. Let me quickly explain why I took it down. While overall I was quite happy with the kit, in my opinion it needed a fair bit of modification to make it a reliable touring setup. The included bump stops were too short and relied too much on the shock's internal bump zone. So Solve needed to create an extension for the extension. The kit also took the Toyota OME progressive bump stops, which work brilliantly, out of the equation. So we needed to manufacture extensions to keep them in use. The shock length was around 2 inches too long for my liking and had bind in the front and in the rear. So we needed to install limiting straps to prevent any bind. However, the ride quality of the shocks was great, and so were the springs so far. After my video appeared and a few people purchased the quite expensive kit, I received a few messages from people who seemed to have issues with receiving their items they paid for, and in general dealing with the distributor. Given that I also had waited nearly 6 months longer than the initial promised ETA, and many deadlines were continuously extended, I was not happy with the situation. Since then, I also received some very questionable advice from the distributor in regards to my engine tune and later in regards to my supposedly wrong rebuilt gearbox, and found him very, very difficult to deal with. For me, a product is only as good as a service, and personally I would not have purchased from him again solely based on the way he deals with customers. So I felt that I could not longer recommend the setup to my followers and hence pulled the video. After a bit over a year, my passenger front Slinky coil broke in the cruiser on one of my Simpson crossings. Not expecting much, I contacted the distributor, but the warranty was refused. So to summarize, while the shocks are excellent, even though they could be a bit shorter, the whole kit needed modifications. The springs did not last long, and after all, I would not purchase the kit again. I already replaced all my Slinky springs with custom Solve Off-Road King springs, and they work very well so far. If I would do it all again, I would purchase the Solve springs and then purchase 2.5 King or Fox remote reservoir adjustable shocks instead of the Icon shocks. So there's one last thing which is currently in progress but isn't finalized yet, and that are my new diff housings. On my last Fraser Island trip I missed one of the washouts and cracked my front housing and slightly bent my rear housing, so it was time for an upgrade there. I went with Rampt Customs for some custom chromoly housings. There may be a little bit overkill, and I'm certainly sure I will not break them unless I really have an accident. However, I have a fairly high load carrying capacity with a GVM upgrade of 4.2 tons, because when I do remote desert trips I need to carry a lot of fuel and water with me and really need a high carrying capacity. And with these new chromoly diff housings I really should never have a problem anymore in regards to housing strength. Otherwise I really have nothing planned for the cruiser, and I reckon it is my absolute perfect touring vehicle. As always guys, my channel is fully self-funded. I have no sponsored, I don't do any paid promotions. So if you can, please like, subscribe, share my videos, and if possible even consider shouting me a few cups of coffee with a Patreon sponsorship, where you can, with a micro payment, help me to recover a little bit of the cost of running this channel. Please don't forget to let me know in the comment section whether you reckon I missed something or there is still another modification on the Landcruiser which I should do. Looking forward to hear from you. Thanks a lot and see you along the tracks.